So backstage, Jon said, it's really hard. It's not perfect, but I'm going to make it seem like it's perfect. And I said, nuh-uh, I am not letting you get away with that. So with that, we're going to start off. So one of Box's sort of statements is that you're going to, just want to make sure I get below customer minds, and then you've taken it one step further to say, through great experiences with your customers.
Yep.
What does that mean?
Well, so we've had a set of core values since around 2011 when we first wrote them down, and we've been through one major revision of those. Below our customers' minds was the one value that we did not change at all, no wordsmithing at all. We changed a few others in some small ways, but it's really been core to how we think about the product that we build, the services we provide. And in customer success, our objective is to really delight our customers as much as possible. And I want to talk a little bit more about delight and happiness and outcomes and all that. We'll get into that in a little bit, but I would just sort of start with this, maybe a little bit of foreshadowing. I think delight or happiness is important but insufficient. So I think it's about more than just blowing your customers' minds with the experience. There's got to be a lot more to it than that. We'll get into it.
Totally.
Yeah.
So almost everyone in customer success feels like they have to, delight their customers and have customer centricity across their organization. But when push comes to shove, when you're not meeting your revenue targets or when product is delayed on their latest release, the whole world of let's make sure that the customer's voice is in the room kind of goes out the window. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to how you entered. Like, things are not perfect. There's always issues. We're dealing with software. I assume most people in here are in software companies, and I have a degree in computer science. Software doesn't always work. And oftentimes we're dealing with the gap in expectations between what the customer bought or thinks they bought and what the product actually can do, right? And that expectation gap is probably the number one thing that CS teams have to do. Is kind of close that gap as much as possible. There's always some gap. It's never perfect.
So give us some tips.
Yeah.
How do you close that expectation gap?
Well, I think part of it is understanding what the customer's objectives were from day one, and I think this is an area where we can all get better. And this was one of the things I was joking about. Is I'd love to say we're perfect at this. We're not. If you think about it, when your customer's going through a sales cycle, they are telling you very explicitly what their problem set is, and you're telling them why you think your product can help solve those problems, right? So you're capturing this really, really useful information for the lifetime of the customer, and then guess what happens? The deal gets done, the account gets handed over to an account team, whether it's your consultants or your CSMs or your account managers or whoever it is, and all of that great knowledge that you acquired throughout the sales cycle is gone. What is the most frustrating question you can ask a new customer? Tell me what you like to do. Why'd you buy? Or tell me what you like to do with our product. They're like, I've been telling your salespeople that for the last 6, 8, 12 weeks, right? So why are you asking me this question? Those handoffs are so critical, right, to making sure that expectation gap is as small as possible. Understanding what the customer thought they were buying, why they thought they were buying it, and making sure the people who are going to service that customer from that point forward is really, really critical. If you don't do that well, you're starting off in a really bad place. Now, there may still be expectation gaps, but if you can identify it early, you can kind of start to reset. If needed, bring the salesperson back into the conversation to kind of help realign things. I've had to do that a ton in my consulting career. Sometimes you have to do that, but it's better to do that on day one than to do it 3 days before the renewal when the customer says, I'm not getting any of the things I thought I was getting when I bought your product.
Yeah, so I want to make sure everyone caught that, right? The handoff moment is one of the most critical things you can do to ensure customer success. And it's not just handoff from sales to your implementation team, it's all throughout the customer lifecycle. But you're doing some interesting things on that initial handoff. It's the first moment that your team gets to delight them post-sale. So what types of things are you doing?
Yeah, one of the things that we've evolved to is a joint account plan, which is probably not a new concept to anyone who's been in software for a while. But what I think is sort of interesting about the way we're thinking about it is it's not just a joint account plan to get the deal done, right? It's a joint account plan for sort of what happens beyond that, and it's shared between or among the salesperson, the sales engineer, the consulting team, if there's a consulting engagement, the CSM, et cetera, all accessed through a common Salesforce object, right? Not uncommon, and augmented with narrative and contextual information in a box note, which is one of the mechanisms we have built into our product. So you kind of pull these things together, and now everyone's got access to the exact same information. You don't have sales in Salesforce and the CSM in another system and the consultant somewhere else. They can all go to that one place. And what should be captured there, and we've got a template for it, is exactly what I talked about. What were the customer's business objectives, right? How are we going to meet them? What are the use cases? And what should happen in a perfect world is that document lives throughout the life of the customer. And in my really, really ideal world, and I'd love to like almost go back in time and say, let's do this from day one, you would take the set of customer business objectives that they outlined for you during the sales process, you'd write them down. And then in every subsequent meaningful conversation with the customer, you would be reverting back to that set of objectives, right? So think about the consulting, the implementation kickoff. Mr. and Mrs. Customer, here's what you said your objectives are. Is this right? Revalidate it. They can say, oh no, you got that one slightly wrong, but what they're not gonna say is, I've already told you this, right? You're gonna refine it.
You know why?
You know why?
You know why though? They have amnesia. They like forget.
There's some intentional amnesia that happens.
It's intentional.
There's definitely some of that goes on. But then you think about the closeout of the consulting project. Again, here's what we said we would do, here's what we did. And what we've strived to do that I would encourage all of you to think about is build a backlog of future requirements as you're working with the customer. So don't just go back to the original 3 things that they said they cared about. What you're gonna find through your implementations and through your account relationship is that more things will pop up. They'll come up with use cases you hadn't thought of if your product is sort of expandable in that way. And we see that all the time. They'll come up with something, it's like, oh, we never thought about that. Keep adding that to your backlog. And so when you go into your renewal conversation, what you've got now is a documented history of original requirements, how you did against those, requirements that got added over time. Maybe we're still working on those, but you've essentially got a really clear definition of the value you've delivered and have yet to deliver to the customer. So,
you know what that helps with?
Retention.
Yeah, and also handoffs, right?
And
handoffs when someone on your CS team leaves or changes function, all of a sudden you have this living, breathing document that makes it really easy to jump in. So I love that. That's great.
Yep.
So let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about the subject that no one likes to talk about in customer success. Let's go to churn, and then we'll go to something a little more fun. Cool. So.
Yeah, well, what's churn?
Yeah, okay.
It's not a thing we do.
What? I'm working on this new thing. Churn's not a CS problem anymore. Let's let product own it.
I think we'd all agree. How many people here are in customer success? Anyone? Not that many. All right, but
how many people here know what customer success is? There we go.
Excellent.
We got some hands.
Yeah, I do think this is a really important point because there is the tendency to sort of look around the executive staff table when you've got a problem with churn or you're losing a customer and look at the CS lady or look at the CS guy and be like, what are you doing about it? Like, well, let's talk about it. This is a company challenge. It's not it's an individual department challenge. At the same time, I think this notion of the whole company owns retention, there's no accountability, that's also not the right way to go either. So I think you need someone in a role like mine, I'm a chief customer officer at Box, but it can't be entirely my problem to solve, right? If there's a gap, we go back to the point about expectations. If there's an expectation gap between what the customer was sold and what the product actually does, that's a product problem. It's not a customer success problem, right? It is in the sense that I'm going to have a churn event, but I can't solve it without the product organization. So one of the things that I push on a lot in terms of my role is that in customer success, you tend to think a lot about here's what our responsibility is to our customers, but what we tend to forget about is we also have a massive responsibility to our companies. And that responsibility I think of as voice of the customer. People talk about voice of the customer a lot, but it's how do I bring the customer sentiment, what the customer asks for, what they want, what problems they think we should solve that we can't. You have to bring that into the company. And you have to be the really loud sort of voice that's banging on the table if necessary to say, we've got to go fix this problem or we've got to add this feature or whatever on behalf of your customers.
Okay, let's get real about this because this is a great thing to say.
Yep.
But you are a large company with lots of CSMs, lots of customer-facing roles. Your team is hearing from customers all the time. How do you actually get that message through to the people who need to hear it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's partially a problem of is there enough credibility and respect for that part of the organization where people are going to listen? That's one issue. I think I'm pretty lucky there. I've been with Box for 8 years. I've been part of the executive team. Like we don't have an issue of like John doesn't know what he's talking about, or that like he doesn't really represent our customers. Everyone knows I do, right? So, and I think what I would encourage all of you is make sure you have that person who has the credibility, who comes from the customer-facing side, and make sure they're in the room in those conversations. That's really important. Probably the bigger issue, though, is we have 95,000 customers. There is no voice of the customer, right? There's 95,000, and by the way, a lot of our customers have multiple voices too, because you've got developers, and you've got end users, and you've got admins, you've got the CIO. So I think the job of a customer success organization at some level is to synthesize a lot of that and try and figure out what really matters and help the product team understand what matters. And just keep in mind that you're one of many channels of feedback to the product team. So you're not going to get everything you want, clearly. The product team has to think about what the company's strategy is, what the competitors are doing, what industry analysts are telling them. So you're one of many, but you have to be a strong voice. And I think just continually beating the drum, pounding the table, whatever it is, in the right settings to say, what about the customer's perspective on this is just critical. And I've been guilty myself of like my voice not being loud enough. And the thing you have to remember is not really your voice, you're just amplifying the voice of your customers. And if that doesn't give you power in the organization, then you're probably at the wrong organization. So
that's a good point too.
Yeah.
So how do you even look at churn? Because you have a lot of customers, right? You 95,000, and they come in all different shapes and sizes.
Yeah, so there's an adage, I think Nick Mehta might have invented this, I'm not sure. He basically says companies will either tell you how they measure churn or what their churn number is, but they'll never tell you both. And we're probably a little bit in that camp. But when I think about churn, or if you want to put it in the positive way, retention, you have very different profiles, to your point, based on the way your customers are segmented. So we have IBM and General Electric as customers. Obviously, the way I think about churn in a customer set like that is very different than a 3-seat, accounting firm that's using Box to collaborate with their clients. Both important customers to us, and in their own ways contribute to kind of what we are as a company. But we treat them very differently. We see different retention rates, and there's a natural churn rate that happens in your smaller customers just based on the economics of their own business, right? The fact that they may be acquired or go out of business, may have to downsize. And so what you have to do is figure out what those sort of, like almost what the tiers are, like where those natural tiers live, and then figure out what is a reasonable churn rate I'm comfortable with for each of those tiers, and then target that. And obviously baseline and always strive to improve.
So with that in mind, do you let some customers go? Because it's hard to save customers. It takes a lot of energy.
Yeah.
So do you just sort of look at that and say, okay, well, since we can handle this type of churn rate, we'll just let some of these go and not waste our resources and energy?
It's a really interesting question, because there's a part of you when you're running, a lot of you are running your own companies, there's probably a part of you that says, I don't want to lose any customers ever.
Ever.
Right? Yeah. And I think one way to think about it is to think about, think of it as like either, I use the term like natural or organic churn, like churn that you just know is going to happen because of, again, all the things I talked about before, economics of the business. What is that number? And then figure out, how do I get everything else as close to zero as possible? So it's not you're trying to get the whole thing to zero, because that's impossible. But if you said, look, naturally, my customers who spend $100,000 a year with us are going to churn at a rate of 3% a year, let's just make something up, because of things like acquisitions or, change in strategy or a partnership with one of your competitors, whatever it is. Okay, that's your natural churn rate or organic churn rate or systemic, whatever you want to call it. Then go try and combat everything else, right? Everything beyond that, where you should have more control because it's a product issue or a service issue, that kind of thing. So I think you just kind of have to separate those out in your head. And there are some cases where you do need to, fire customers, and no one really likes to talk about it. I can tell you, I had one of the most uncomfortable emails in my career pretty recently, where the account team came to me and said, we don't want to renew this customer under the contract that they have now because it doesn't make economic sense for us, and we want you to send the email. Well, normally when I'm sending emails to customers, it's to try to convince them to stay. It's not to fire them, right? So I was like, I'm not super comfortable with this, but it was the right thing. It was a legacy customer who had a deal that didn't really make sense today, made a lot of sense then. And we're not saying we don't want you as a customer.
How long were they a customer?
They're a 6-year customer. And this is a tough thing, right? Because the customer's perspective is, I took a bet on you guys when you were much smaller, unknown. It's like, it totally makes sense. It's not that we don't want you as a customer. We just need to find a relationship that works for us both commercially. And this one's not.
Can we just be clear on one thing?
Sure.
You broke up with a customer of 6 years over email?
No, it was a phone. It was a phone call.
Okay. That's like
there was an
breaking
email
up a
drafted,
text
but no, it was a
message.
phone call.
All right.
So, but this is very uncommon, and I mean, I think for the most part, that's not what you're doing. And this one happened to be like we're a public company. We have gross margin requirements. We report to the street. We have to think about these kinds of things. And there's some times where a customer relationship just doesn't work, and it's got to work in both directions. I didn't come up here to talk about firing customers.
No, but it's
you tricked me.
I didn't trick you. I didn't even know where this is going.
All right. So I have a long-running joke with my team, which is I'm chief customer officer or head of customer success or whatever, but my actual title is vice president of I'm sorry. And if any of you are in customer success, you know
We're
exactly.
in Canada. We say sorry.
Oh yeah. I'll try that. Vice president of I'm sorry. I don't think I can do it. It turns out you can acquire a skill of apologizing. It's actually a learned skill that you can have.
Yeah. It's a good one. So there's a healthy debate amongst the customer success community around a few things. Should there be a separate renewals manager, or should the CSM handle renewals? I know you have your own renewals team. We only have a few minutes, and I have a couple more questions.
Yeah, I can go quickly.
Can you talk about why and...
Yeah, I think this is one of those philosophical, religious kinds of things where you sort of believe one thing or you believe another thing. And my belief on this is very simple. I don't want CSMs doing transactions. And I'm not saying that if people do that it's wrong. It's just in my world, that's not the model that I prefer. And so we have a separate renewals function. It is part of the customer success team. But the people doing that job of driving transactions, negotiating with customers, working on a commission and a quota, that's a different set of people. My CSMs are ideally commercially minded, but they're not transactional.
So how do you manage the customer building this amazing relationship with your CSM, and then push comes to shove, it's time for renewal, and all of a sudden it's, oh, well, let's go talk to this person you've never met before and knows nothing about your business. Yeah,
I think a lot of it goes back to the handoffs we were talking about earlier, which is do we have a common account plan that we're all working to? It's the relationships between the CSMs and the renewal teams. And in fact, one of the reasons we moved renewals from sales to CS was to kind of tighten up those relationships.
Oh, that definitely, if you're going to have a renewals team, have it in CS.
Yeah, that's my view. And sales leaders may disagree. And I think you can make it work in either direction. But, for us, it actually works pretty well to have them working really closely and make sure you're doing warm handoffs and all those things. But a lot of it, again, just comes down to you don't want the renewal manager going into that conversation blind to what's been happening, what the customer context is. You should be capturing all the stuff in your CRM, right? In your, whether it's Gainsight or Salesforce or whatever it is, capture that information so the account team knows what's going on. What you never want to have happen is your renewal manager walk into a renewal conversation with a customer surprised by the fact that they don't want to renew.
Yes.
Or that they don't believe they're getting value from your solution. That's a really awkward conversation to have.
Yeah. That's awful.
So don't do that.
Don't do that.
Don't do that.
And your team, because of that nature of not wanting them to be transactional and negotiating with customers, your team does not handle upsells and cross-sells, but your team is the most qualified to really identify and help plant that seed for growth. So you have a separate account management team that lives inside sales, right? Mm-hmm. So what's the relationship between CS and sales?
Yeah, I think what you want to create is an environment where sales, renewals, and CSMs are all aligned around one common objective. And I think the most core common objective for that set of people is net retention, right? So how does the value of a portfolio of customers grow over time, right? If they're all thinking about it that way, and that doesn't mean they're all compensated exactly the same way, but they're all aligned to that as a set of objectives, then the CSM should be thinking about not just how do I defend the current value of the portfolio, because that's a component of net retention, but also how do I help identify opportunities for expansion, cross-sell, whatever that is, not run the transaction, but identify the opportunities. And if there's an existing opportunity, how do I help the account team actually nurture those opportunities because of the relationships that I have? Again, I think it's really important that you separate these things. The CSM has a trusted relationship with the customer that's based on the fact that the customer does not believe they're trying to sell them something, right? Preserve that relationship, but also make sure that you are thinking commercially and growing the value of the relationship over time. And that's a fine line to walk, but I think it's an important one.
And you mentioned something interesting when we were chatting earlier, that your product is very usage-based, but you can't renew and grow based on usage. So what do you do?
I mean, you've got to identify additional use cases. You've got to identify additional user populations. You've got to listen to the customer when they say, I have a problem or a challenge in my business. And if you think really narrowly and you say, well, our product doesn't do that, move on, it's not a very interesting conversation. But if you think, well, with our API or with our partner ecosystem or with some configuration, actually we could solve that problem, that's a very different conversation. And again, it's not the CSM's job to then go turn that into a transaction and sell it. But guess what? Go talk to your counterpart in sales and say, I think there's something interesting here. We should have a further conversation about it.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
John, you're doing some great things.
Thank you.
No small feat. Yes, you're not perfect, but you're doing a great job. It was great chatting with you today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
I need some traction. You need some traction. Let's get some traction.